The first signal didn't come with explosions, it came with laughter. Across the vast command chamber of the Imperial War Council, dozens of alien species stood in quiet attention as the projection of a small blue planet rotated slowly in the air. Oceans shimmered, clouds drifted, continents glowed under a distant sun. And then, one of the admirals laughed. "Primitive," he said. Another joined in, then another. Within seconds, the chamber filled with low, amused murmurs. Earth, a world barely unified, a species still divided by borders, languages, and ideologies. Their technology? Fragmented. Their defenses? Inconsistent. Their military doctrine? Predictable. To the Empire, it was barely worth the effort, which is why they chose it. Because sometimes, conquest wasn't about challenge. Sometimes, it was about sending a message. "Mark the planet," the High Strategist ordered, his voice calm, almost bored. Classification: easy conquest. Minimal resistance expected. The holographic display shifted. A single red symbol appeared over Earth. Target acquired. And in that moment, humanity was officially declared expendable. What the Empire didn't realize, what none of them could possibly understand, was that Earth had already seen the mark. Not the symbol, but the intention behind it. Because, for the first time in human history, every satellite, every defense system, every military command structure across the planet lit up at once. No speeches, no panic, no chaos, just silence and action. If you're new here on HFY Global Tales, this is where humanity's story begins to turn. And trust me, you'll want to stay until the end of this one. Make sure you like and subscribe, because what happens next, the Empire never saw coming. The Imperial fleet arrived 3 weeks later. Not because it took them that long to travel, but because they didn't hurry. Why would they? Victory was already assumed. Their ships emerged at the edge of the solar system in perfect formation. Massive, gleaming constructs of war. Each vessel carried weapons capable of erasing cities. Each commander carried centuries of battle experience. They had conquered hundreds of worlds. Earth would be another line in the archive. "Deploy reconnaissance," Admiral Valen ordered, barely glancing at the planet on his display. Small scout vessels detached from the fleet, slicing through the void toward the inner system. As they approached Mars, they found nothing. No defense grid, no interceptors, no resistance. "Continue," Valen said. The scouts moved past the asteroid belt. Still nothing. No ships, no signals, no attempt to communicate. That was strange. Primitive species often panic, one of his officers noted. "We should be detecting emergency broadcasts, defensive mobilization, something." Instead, there was silence, a complete, unnatural silence. By the time the scouts reached Earth's orbit, that silence had become impossible to ignore. Cities were still active. Lights burned across continents. Satellites remained in position, but no transmissions were being sent outward. No warnings, no threats, no pleas. Just quiet. "Perhaps they've already surrendered," another officer suggested. Valen narrowed his eyes. "No," he said slowly. "This is not surrender." Because surrender was loud. It was desperate. It was chaotic. This felt controlled, calculated, deliberate, and that made it dangerous. "Scan for military assets," he ordered. The sensors swept across the planet. They detected ships, but not many. A handful of vessels scattered across orbital space. Old designs, outdated propulsion systems, primitive weapon signatures. Valen almost laughed. "This is their defense?" he asked. One of the officers hesitated. "Admiral, their ships are positioning." The display shifted. The human vessels weren't advancing. They weren't retreating. They were spreading out. Not in a defensive line. Not in any recognizable formation. Just drifting into seemingly random positions around the planet. "What are they doing?" Valen demanded. No one answered, because no one understood it. And that was the first mistake. "Signal them," Valen said. "Issue standard surrender protocol." A transmission was sent. Clear, direct, unmistakable. "This is the Imperial Armada. Your planet has been designated for assimilation. Power down all defenses and prepare for occupation. Resistance will result in immediate annihilation. The message echoed through Earth's orbit. Seconds passed, then minutes. Still no response. The silence remained. Valen's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest of his command chair. They heard us. Yes, Admiral. And they choose not to respond. Yes, Admiral. He leaned forward, studying the scattered human ships. Then we will remind them why silence is a mistake. He raised his hand. Prepared demonstration strike. One of the Imperial cruisers moved forward, its massive weapon arrays beginning to charge. Target: an uninhabited region of Earth's ocean. A warning shot. A display of power. Enough to break their silence. The energy built, glowing brighter, stronger. And then, Admiral. The voice came sharp, urgent. Multiple contacts detected. Valen frowned. From where? The officer's expression shifted from confusion to something else. Something colder. They were already there. The display changed. And suddenly, the emptiness of space wasn't empty anymore. Dozens, no hundreds, of small objects appeared across the system. Hidden, silent, undetectable until now. What are those? Valen asked. No one had an answer. Because they weren't ships. They weren't weapons. They weren't anything the Empire recognized. Until they moved. At once. Every single one of them. And in that instant, the war didn't begin with a battle. It began with a realization. This wasn't going to be easy. And somewhere, deep within the Imperial fleet, for the first time, someone felt fear. The Empire had faced thousands of species. Some fought with desperation, some with honor, some with blind, chaotic fury. But none had ever greeted them with silence like this. Admiral Valen stood frozen for half a second longer than he would ever admit. His eyes locked on the tactical display as hundreds of previously invisible objects shifted into motion across the solar system. They hadn't appeared. They had always been there, hidden in the dark, waiting. Identify them, he snapped. Sensors flooded the data streams, analyzing shape, energy output, trajectory. The results came back, inconsistent. Admiral, they're too small to be warships. Then what are they? A pause. We don't know. That answer alone should not have been possible. The Empire cataloged everything. Every weapon, every strategy, every known method of war. And yet this didn't fit. Track movement patterns, Valen ordered, forcing his voice steady. Predict engagement vectors. The officer hesitated again. They aren't forming attack lines. Defensive positions. No, Admiral. Another pause. This one heavier. They're spreading irregularly. No pattern. No formation. Valen leaned forward. Chaos. That's what it looked like. Unorganized. Inefficient. Primitive. And yet, something about it felt intentional. Like pieces being placed on a board the Empire couldn't see. Maintain course, Valen said at last. Proceed with demonstration strike. The cruiser's weapon continued charging, the glow intensifying until it burned like a second sun against the darkness. If humanity wanted to play games, this would end it. Fire. The beam lanced forward. A column of pure energy tore through space and slammed into Earth's ocean, vaporizing miles of water in an instant. Steam exploded upward, forming a massive white scar visible even from orbit. A warning. A statement. Power. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Admiral, those objects. Valen's gaze snapped back to the display. They had stopped moving. All of them. At once. As if reacting to the strike. Are they retreating? Someone asked. No, another officer whispered. They're locking onto us. And suddenly, the silence broke. Not with words. With motion. Every single hidden object accelerated at once. Not toward the Empire's ships, but past them. Straight through their formation. What are they doing? Valen demanded. Collision course, an officer guessed. But the trajectories didn't match. They weren't targeting ships directly. They were targeting space itself. Then the first one activated. A pulse. Invisible to the eye, but devastating to sensors. The entire forward grid of the Imperial fleet flickered. Signal disruption detected. Before anyone could respond, another pulse, then another, then hundreds. The fleet systems began to stutter. Communications fractured into static. Targeting arrays lost lock. What is happening? Valen roared. Admiral, we're losing synchronization between ships. That wasn't possible. Imperial fleets operated as a single organism, perfectly coordinated, flawlessly connected. But now, that connection was breaking. Re-established network. We're trying. Another pulse hit. This time, it wasn't just systems. It was space. The stars themselves seemed to distort. Not physically, but perceptually. Distances warped. Positions shifted. Ships that should have been aligned suddenly appeared off. Navigation error, someone shouted. Our relative positioning is inconsistent, another finished. Valen felt it then. Not fear. Not yet. But something colder. Uncertainty. The human ships still hadn't fired a single shot. They hadn't engaged directly. They had simply changed the battlefield. And the Empire didn't understand how. Deploy countermeasures, Valen ordered. Stabilize formation. But it was already too late. Because the next phase had begun. Admiral, contacts closing. This time, the human ships were moving. Those same outdated, unimpressive vessels. Now accelerating with terrifying precision. They didn't charge in formation. They didn't follow attack patterns. They moved like fragments, independent, unpredictable, impossible to anticipate. Target them. Valen commanded. Imperial weapons locked, or tried to. Targeting systems are fluctuating. Manual override. Gunners took control. Fired. Beams of energy sliced through space. And missed. Not because the humans dodged, but because the shots were off. By fractions. Tiny miscalculations. But enough. What is wrong with our targeting? Valen demanded. Admiral, our sensors and our firing solutions aren't matching. The realization hit the room like a shockwave. They weren't missing. They were aiming wrong. Because the battlefield itself had been altered. And then, the first human ship fired. A single kinetic round. No energy signature. No warning. Just a solid projectile launched at impossible speed. It struck an Imperial frigate dead center. And punched straight through it. Clean. Silent. Lethal. The ship didn't explode immediately. It simply stopped. Power gone. Systems dead. A heartbeat later, it broke apart. Valen's breath caught. One hit, someone whispered. That's not possible. But it had happened. And then it happened again. Another human ship fired. Another Imperial vessel fell. Then another. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Each shot perfect. Each impact catastrophic. Return fire. Valen roared. The fleet unleashed everything. Energy beams. Missile swarms. Point defense grids. Space lit up with destruction. But the humans, they were never where they were supposed to be. Moving through the distorted battlefield like they understood it, like they had designed it. Because they had. Admiral, an officer said quietly. Valen didn't look away from the screen. What? This isn't a defense. A pause. This is a trap. Another Imperial ship vanished from a display. Then another. Then three at once. The formation was collapsing. Not from overwhelming force, but from precise, surgical destruction. Fall back, someone suggested. Valen's jaw tightened. The Empire didn't fall back. It adapted. It overcame. It won. But as he watched another cruiser go dark, a thought began to form. Unwelcome. Unfamiliar. Dangerous. What if this enemy was something different? What if this wasn't a primitive world? What if they had been wrong? The human ships pulled back slightly, repositioning. Not retreating. Resetting. Preparing. For the next move. And for the first time in centuries, an Imperial admiral realized something he had never had to consider before. They weren't in control. Not of the battle. Not of the space around them. Not even of their own fleet. And somewhere, hidden within the silent coordination of humanity's forces, a single truth became clear. This war, had started long before the Empire arrived. The first losses could still be explained away. That's what Admiral Valen told himself. A miscalculation, an unfamiliar technology, a temporary disruption. The Empire had faced surprises before. It had never lost because of them. Stabilize the fleet, he ordered, his voice colder now, sharper. Reform defensive alignment. I want full redundancy across all systems. Around him, the command crew moved with urgency, fingers dancing across controls as they attempted to force order back into a battlefield that refused to obey. But the numbers on the display kept shifting. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to make certainty impossible. Admiral, we're still experiencing spatial drift, one officer reported. Distances between ships are fluctuating by fractional margins. Compensate. We are. But the corrections keep changing. Valen's eyes narrowed. That shouldn't happen. Space didn't behave like that. Unless something was making it. Then stop relying on automated calculations, he snapped. Manual targeting. Manual navigation. Trust your instincts if you have to. It was a primitive order, the kind of thing lesser species relied on. And yet it was the only option left. Because the Empire's greatest strength, its flawless precision, had been turned against it. Report on enemy fleet, Valen demanded. A new display flickered into view. Human ships. Still scattered. Still inconsistent. Still wrong. They're not holding any formation, the officer said. No central command structure detected. Each vessel appears to be operating independently. That's impossible, another officer muttered. No fleet can function without coordination. Valen didn't respond immediately, because deep down, he was starting to understand. They are coordinated, he said quietly. The room fell silent, but not in a way we recognize. The human ships moved again, not as a unit, not as a fleet, but like a storm of fragments, each piece separate, yet somehow part of a larger whole. No signals, no visible communication, and yet no collisions, no hesitation, no mistakes. They're predicting us, someone whispered. No, Valen said. They're shaping us. That was the difference. The Empire reacted. Humans anticipated. And then, Admiral, new contacts detected. Valen turned sharply. Where? The officer zoomed out the display, far beyond the immediate battlefield, beyond Earth's orbit, near the asteroid belt. Dozens of new signals, then hundreds, then thousands. Valen felt something twist in his chest. That's not possible, one of the crew said. Those weren't there before. No, Valen replied slowly. They were hidden, just like the others, waiting. What are they? The officer asked. This time, the answer came quickly. Ships, Valen said. But they're old, the officer added, confusion bleeding into his voice. Outdated designs. Some of them barely qualify as combat capable. On the display, the new fleet looked mismatched. Different sizes, different shapes, different configurations. A collection of vessels that should never have been grouped together. It didn't look like a navy. It looked like salvage. They're bringing reinforcements, someone asked. Valen's gaze hardened. No, he said. They're revealing them. Because this wasn't a response. This was part of the plan. The Empire had entered the system thinking they were facing a single planetary defense. They hadn't. They had stepped into a layered battlefield, one that extended far beyond Earth. Estimate total enemy numbers, Valen ordered. The system processed, hesitated, then displayed the result. Incomplete, the officer said quietly. We can't get an accurate count. More signals keep appearing. Valen stared at the screen. For the first time since the campaign began, the Empire didn't have superior numbers. They didn't have superior positioning. And they definitely didn't have understanding. Admiral, another officer said, his voice tight. We're detecting movement from the new fleet. The distant ships began to shift. Slowly at first, then faster. Not charging directly, not rushing in, but spreading, encircling, cutting off angles. They're not reinforcing the battle, Valen realized. They're controlling it. The realization hit like a physical blow. Every direction the Empire could move was being closed. Not aggressively, not obviously, just enough, just subtle enough to limit options, to guide decisions, to trap. Break formation, Valen ordered suddenly. The room froze. Admiral? Break formation. Scatter the fleet. Independent vectors. Maximum distance. It was the opposite of everything the Empire stood for. But staying together was exactly what the humans wanted. The order went out. Imperial ships began to split apart, engines flaring as they attempted to create space, real space, between each other. For a moment, it worked. The distortions lessened. Targeting stabilized slightly. Good, one officer said. We're regaining. Admiral. The interruption was sharp. Panicked. Those objects, the small ones, they're changing trajectory again. Valen's eyes snapped back to the display. The hidden devices. The ones that had disrupted their systems. They were moving again. Faster this time. More focused. They're following us, the officer said. Of course they are, Valen muttered. Because the humans weren't reacting to the fleet's formation. They were reacting to its behavior. Learning. Adapting. In real time. Point defense. Target those objects. Valen ordered. Weapons systems adjusted. Fired. And, this time, some of the objects were destroyed. Small explosions flickered across the void. But not enough. Not nearly enough. Impact in 3-2. The next wave hit. Harder. Stronger. The distortions returned. Worse than before. Ships that had just separated now found their positions, bending again. Not physically, but functionally. Admiral, we're losing navigational coherence again. Maintain control. Valen snapped. But even as he said it, he knew they weren't regaining control. They were borrowing it. And the humans could take it back whenever they wanted. Then, Admiral, incoming transmission. The room went still. Every eye turned toward the communication officer. Source. Valen asked. The officer swallowed. Human. Of course it was. Valen straightened slightly. Put it through. The screen shifted. Static flickered. Then cleared. A human face appeared. Calm. Unshaken. Watching. For a moment neither side spoke. And in that silence, something changed. Because this wasn't the Empire observing a primitive species anymore. This was two opponents finally seeing each other clearly. You took your time, the human said. The voice was steady, measured, almost conversational. Valen's expression hardened. You will identify yourself. A faint smile. Not important. A pause. What matters is that you're exactly where we needed you to be. A chill ran through the room. Valen leaned forward. You believe this changes your fate? The human tilted their head slightly. No, they said. I know it does. Behind them, unseen, the battle continued. Imperial ships struggling. Human forces maneuvering. The trap tightening. And for the first time since the Empire had declared Earth an easy conquest, they were no longer the ones asking questions. They were the ones being answered. The Empire had always believed that war followed rules. Not laws of physics, those could be bent, stretched, even weaponized, but rules of logic, strategy, order, cause and effect. You attacked. The enemy defended. You advanced. The enemy retreated. You applied pressure. The enemy broke. Simple, predictable, proven across thousands of conquered worlds. But here, in the silent chaos surrounding Earth, none of it was working. Admiral Valen stood rigid as the battlefield continued to slip further beyond his understanding. The Imperial fleet, once a flawless machine of synchronized destruction, now moved like a fractured organism, each part struggling to reconnect to a whole that no longer existed. Status report, he demanded. Fleet cohesion at 43%, an officer replied, voice tight. Command synchronization is degrading. We're operating in fragmented clusters. Clusters, not a fleet. That word alone was unacceptable. And the enemy? A pause. They're everywhere. The display reflected it. Human ships, those same mismatched, outdated vessels. moved through the chaos with terrifying confidence. They didn't avoid the distortion fields. They used them. Where Imperial ships hesitated, recalculated, second-guessed, human ships committed. They cut through impossible angles, appearing where sensors insisted they shouldn't be, striking from vectors that defied prediction. "How are they navigating this?" one officer whispered. Valen answered without looking away. "Because they built it." And then, "Admiral, we've lost another cruiser." The marker blinked out. Gone. No explosion this time. No visible impact. Just gone. Cause. Valen snapped. Unknown. One moment it was there, the next. "Admiral," another voice interrupted, sharper. Multiple disappearances confirmed. The display shifted again. Not one ship. Not two. 5. All gone within seconds. No debris. No signal. Nothing. A cold silence spread through the command chamber. "That's not destruction," someone said quietly. "That's removal." The word hung in the air like a threat. Removed. From the battlefield. From existence. From reality? Valen's jaw tightened. "Find them." "We're scanning, Admiral." "No trace." "No trace." "Impossible. Unless." "Admiral, we're detecting localized spatial anomalies." There it was. Finally. A clue. Define anomaly. Short-range distortions. Extremely brief. Like something folding space inward, then releasing it. Valen's mind raced. Not weapons. Not exactly. More like doors. "You're saying they're not destroying our ships," he said slowly. "They're moving them?" The officer hesitated. "We don't know where." That was worse. Destruction was final. Understandable. But this was control. Complete and absolute. "Admiral, incoming fire." Valen snapped back to the present. A human vessel had broken through the distortion field, closing distance at an angle no Imperial algorithm would ever consider viable. Intercept. Too late. The human ship fired. Not a beam. Not a missile. A spread of kinetic projectiles. Dozens of them, launched in rapid succession. They didn't aim for critical systems. They didn't target weapons. They struck everywhere. Hull, engines, sensors, communications. Each impact small. Individually insignificant. But together. "System failure cascade," an officer shouted. "They're overloading our infrastructure." The targeted Imperial ship didn't explode. It shut down, piece by piece, until it was nothing more than a drifting shell. Disabled. Helpless. "Why not destroy it?" someone asked. Valen's eyes narrowed. Because that was the question. Why not finish it? Why leave it intact? And then he understood. "They're not trying to win quickly," he said. "They're trying to control the pace." Every destroyed ship was a loss. But every disabled ship was pressure, a weight, a reminder. The Empire wasn't just losing. It was being dismantled. Slowly, deliberately, psychologically. "Admiral," the communications officer said, voice strained. "We're receiving partial transmissions from other clusters." "Put them through." Static filled the air. Broken voices. Fragments of panic. "Can't lock targets." "They're inside our formation." "How?" "Navigation doesn't match visual." "They're not fighting us there." The transmission cut off. Silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. Before it had been controlled. Now, it was cracking. "Admiral," another officer said quietly. Valen didn't respond. "They're learning us." That much was obvious. Every maneuver the Empire attempted was countered. Every adaptation met with a faster, sharper response. It was like fighting an opponent who had already seen every move. "Then we stop being predictable," Valen said. He turned sharply. "All ships, abandon standard doctrine. No formations. No patterns. Randomized engagement. Maximum unpredictability." The order rippled through the fleet. And for a moment, something changed. Imperial ships began to move erratically, breaking every rule, every structure, every expectation. And it worked. Slightly. Human targeting faltered. Not completely, but enough to notice. "They're adjusting," an officer said. "Good," Valen replied. "Force them to." Because if the humans could adapt, then so could the Empire. For the first time since the battle began, Valen felt a flicker of control returning. A chance. A possibility. And then, Admiral, the voice was barely a whisper. Valen looked at the display and felt that flicker die. The distant human fleet, the one near the asteroid belt, had moved again. But this time, they weren't spreading. They were aligning. Not in a standard formation, but in something far worse. A pattern. Not of attack, not of defense, but of structure. Like pieces locking into place. What are they doing? Valen asked. No one answered. Because the answer was already forming. Too big, too complex, too late. Admiral, the officer said, voice shaking slightly. I think they're building something. And as the battlefield continued to twist and collapse under forces the Empire couldn't comprehend, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't even a war. It was an environment, engineered, controlled, owned by humanity. And the Empire had just realized they weren't fighting an enemy fleet. They were trapped inside a system designed to defeat them. The Empire did not fear enemies. It cataloged them, studied them, defeated them. Fear implied uncertainty, and uncertainty had never survived long in Imperial doctrine. Until now, Admiral Valen stood in silence as the battlefield continued to evolve beyond anything he had ever trained for. Ships vanished without destruction. Others were disabled without warning. Space itself bent in ways that defied every known model. And the humans, they were calm. Too calm. Admiral, the intelligence officer said, breaking the silence. We've recovered fragments from one of the disabled ships. Valen didn't look away from the display. Recovered what? Data, sir. Partial logs. External signal interference patterns. And something else. That hesitation again. Valen turned this time. Speak. The officer swallowed. We believe the humans are broadcasting. That made no sense. We have detected no outgoing transmissions, Valen replied. That's just it, Admiral, the officer said carefully. They're not broadcasting in any format we recognize. A screen lit up beside the main display. Patterns. Not language. Not code. Not even consistent signals. Chaotic. Fragmented. Meaningless. At least at first glance. It's noise, one of the crew said. No, the intelligence officer replied quietly. It's layered. The patterns shifted, overlapped, repeated, and suddenly a structure began to emerge. Not in the way Imperial systems process data, but in the way something adaptive might. They're not communicating with us, the officer said. They're communicating with each other. Valen frowned. Without channels? Yes. Without signals? Yes. Then how? They're embedding instructions inside environmental distortion. The room went still. The realization spread slowly, then all at once. The distortions, the anomalies, the very thing disrupting the Empire, was also the thing guiding the humans. They're using the battlefield as a network, someone whispered. Valen felt it click into place. Every unpredictable movement, every perfect shot, every impossible maneuver. It wasn't random. It wasn't instinct. It was coordination, on a level the Empire had never imagined. They don't need formations, Valen said. They don't need commands, because the battlefield itself was telling them what to do. Admiral, the officer said, voice tightening. There's more. Of course there was. There are embedded patterns in the interference we're receiving. Repeating structures, predictable layers. And the officer hesitated. It looks like doctrine. That word hit harder than any weapon. Doctrine, the foundation of war. The rules that defined how a species fought. How can doctrine be embedded in noise? Someone asked. The officer shook his head. It's not noise. It only looks like noise to us. He adjusted the display again. The patterns clarified, aligned, simplified, and suddenly it was readable. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Valen stepped closer. What am I looking at? The officer took a breath. You're looking at how humans fight. The room fell silent, because what they were seeing was not a strategy, not a plan, not even a set of orders. It was something deeper, a philosophy, a system, a way of thinking. They don't aim for victory, the officer said quietly. They aim for inevitability. Valen's eyes narrowed. Explain. They don't try to overpower us. They don't try to outgun us. They don't even try to outmaneuver us directly. The display highlighted multiple battle events, imperial movements, human responses, cause, effect. They shape the environment until every choice we make leads to loss. A cold realization settled over the room. That's not war, someone whispered. That's control. Yes, the officer said. And we're inside it. Valen stared at the patterns, at the logic, at the terrifying simplicity of it. The Empire fought to win. Humans fought to remove the possibility of losing. Admiral, another voice shouted. The moment shattered. New anomalies forming across multiple sectors. Valen snapped his attention back to the battlefield. The distant human fleet, the one that had been aligning, had finished whatever it was building. And now, it was activating. The distortions intensified. Not randomly, not unpredictably, but with purpose. Report. Spatial compression fields detected. Multiple layers. What does that mean? The officer hesitated, then said the words no one wanted to hear. It means the battlefield is getting smaller. Valen's stomach dropped. Define smaller. Distances between our ships are collapsing. Not physically, but functionally. Maneuvering space is being reduced. The implications hit instantly. Less space meant less freedom. Less freedom meant fewer options. Fewer options meant they're removing our ability to maneuver, Valen said, and replacing it with theirs. Imperial ships began to struggle again, their paths narrowing, their movements constrained by invisible forces they couldn't predict. Meanwhile, human ships moved effortlessly through the tightening space, because they knew where it would be, because they had designed it. Admiral were being funneled. The display made it clear. All remaining Imperial clusters were being guided, pushed, directed toward a central region, not by force, but by limitation. Every escape route subtly blocked, every alternative path slightly worse, until only one direction remained. Breakthrough. Valen ordered. Full power. All ships push outward. Engines roared. Ships accelerated. Tried to escape, but the distortions shifted, adjusted, closed. Admiral, it's not working. Of course it wasn't, because this wasn't a cage. It was a current, and they were being carried. Where are they taking us? Someone asked. No one answered, because deep down, they already knew. Admiral, the intelligence officer said, voice low. Valen didn't look at him. What? If this is their doctrine? A pause. Then this isn't the trap. Valen's eyes narrowed. Then what is? The officer swallowed. This is the setup. The words hung in the air like a final warning. Because if this, everything they had experienced so far, was only preparation, then what came next would be something far worse. And as the Imperial fleet was slowly, inevitably drawn toward the center of a battlefield they didn't control, one truth became undeniable. Humanity hadn't just prepared for this war. They had designed every step of it. From the moment the Empire chose Earth, to the moment they could no longer escape. The Empire had always believed reinforcements meant victory. More ships, more firepower, more control. It was a simple equation that had never failed. Until now. Admiral, warp signatures detected outer system. The voice cut through the tension like a blade. Every officer in the command chamber snapped toward the display as new signals ignited across the edge of the solar system. Bright, numerous, familiar, imperial. For the first time since the battle began, something resembling hope flickered. Our reinforcements have arrived, one officer said, almost breathless. Second and third assault fleets confirmed. On the screen, massive warships emerged from warp in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the same overwhelming power that had conquered entire civilizations. Hundreds of vessels, fresh, untouched, fully operational. Valen didn't react immediately. He watched, studied, waited, because something felt wrong. "They're entering standard deployment pattern," the tactical officer reported. "They're forming attack lines toward Earth." Of course they were. That was doctrine. That was how the Empire fought. Direct, overwhelming, efficient, and completely predictable. "Signal them," Valen said quickly. "Warn them." Too late. The reinforcement fleet surged forward, engines burning as they advanced into the inner system, straight into the invisible web humanity had already woven. At first, nothing happened. No explosions, no resistance, no sign of the nightmare that had consumed Valen's fleet. "They're not encountering interference," one officer said, confusion creeping into his voice. Valen's eyes narrowed. Not yet. Because humans didn't react immediately. They waited. They let you move. They let you commit. And then they closed the door. "Admiral," the intelligence officer whispered. "They're inside it now." And like a switch being flipped, the battlefield changed. The distortions ignited all at once. Across every sector, the newly arrived fleets staggered instantly, their perfect formations shattering as spatial inconsistencies ripped through their navigation systems. Multiple system failures reported came the overlapping transmissions. "We're experiencing static, then chaos. Coordinates aren't matching. Collision warning. No, that's not possible. What is happening to space?" Valen closed his eyes for half a second. They had walked into it, exactly as intended. "Admiral," one of his officers said, voice low. "They didn't activate the field until reinforcements arrived." "Of course they didn't," Valen replied. "Because the trap wasn't designed for one fleet. It was designed for all of them. The more ships that entered, the more effective it became." "Human vessels are moving," another officer reported. The display shifted. The scattered human fleet, the one that had been guiding, shaping, controlling, was now repositioning again. But this time, it wasn't subtle. They were converging, not in lines, not in formations, but in layers. Outer units redirected the reinforcement fleets, pushing them inward. Inner units tightened control around Valen's already trapped forces. And at the center, something was forming. "Admiral," the tactical officer said slowly, "they're creating a compression zone." Valen's jaw tightened. "Define." "A region where all spatial distortions are being focused. High-density interference. Limited maneuvering space. Maximum control. A kill zone. Not one built with weapons, but with physics itself." "Can we escape it?" someone asked. The officer didn't answer immediately. Then, "No." The words settled like a verdict, because escape required freedom of movement, and humanity had already taken that away. "Admiral, reinforcement fleets are requesting command authority," the communications officer said. "They're asking for centralized coordination." Valen almost laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "They want order," he said. "They want structure." He looked back at the display, at the chaos, at the precision hidden within it. And that's exactly what will destroy them. Because the more the Empire tried to organize itself, the easier it became to control. "Deny centralized command," Valen ordered. The room froze. "Admiral?" "Force them to operate independently. Break their formations before the humans do it for them." It was the only chance. Small, desperate, but real. The order went out, and slowly, reluctantly, the reinforcement fleets began to fracture, breaking their perfect lines, abandoning doctrine, trying to become unpredictable, trying to survive. And for a moment, it worked. The distortions didn't hit as cleanly. The losses slowed. Human targeting became slightly less precise. "They're adapting," an officer said. Valen nodded. "So are we." But even as he said it, he knew. They were adapting inside a system they didn't control, which meant every improvement, every adjustment, every moment of survival was something the humans had already accounted for. "Admiral," the intelligence officer said quietly. Valen didn't turn. "What now?" "The center." Valen's eyes shifted, focused, at the heart of the battlefield, where everything was being drawn, where the compression was strongest, where the distortions were most intense, where the human fleet was gathering, not scattered anymore, not fragmented, but unified, for the first time since the battle began. And that alone was terrifying. "Why now?" someone whispered. "Why form up now?" Valen answered without hesitation. "Because they don't need to stay hidden anymore." The setup was complete. The battlefield was shaped. The Empire was trapped. Now, they could finish it. "Admiral." Energy spike detected in the center. The display flared. Something was building. Not like a weapon. Not like anything the Empire had seen before. It didn't radiate power outward. It pulled inward, drawing everything toward it. "Gravitational distortion increasing," the officer shouted. "It's affecting ship stability." Imperial vessels began to struggle. Their movements dragged slightly, subtly, toward the center. Not enough to notice at first, but enough. Enough to matter. "They're pulling us in," someone said. "Yes," Valen replied quietly. "They are." Because this wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a mechanism, and the Empire was inside it. The human ships held position around the center, perfectly spaced, perfectly timed, perfectly aligned. Not one wasted movement, not one unnecessary action. Just control. Absolute, complete, terrifying. And as the gravitational pull slowly increased, as the space around them tightened, as the escape routes vanished one by one, Valen felt it. Not uncertainty, not doubt. Something far worse. Understanding. "This isn't a battle," he said softly. No one spoke, because they already knew. This is an execution. And the Empire had already stepped onto the platform. Fear did not exist in the Empire. It was removed during training, conditioned out through centuries of evolution and doctrine. Imperial officers did not panic. They did not hesitate. They adapted. They overcame. They won. That was the truth every soldier believed. Until the reports started coming in. Not from sensors. Not from calculations. From survivors. They knew where we would move before we did. Static tore through the transmission, followed by a sharp burst of interference. It's like the space itself is telling them. Another break. Another voice, overlapping, strained. We can't see them until they're already firing. The channel collapsed into noise. The command chamber fell silent. Not the controlled silence from before. Not the tactical quiet of disciplined minds at work. This silence was different. It carried weight. Because, for the first time, the Empire wasn't just losing ships. It was losing certainty. "Admiral," the communications officer said carefully, "we're receiving more fragmented transmissions from the reinforcement fleets." Valen didn't respond immediately. He already knew what they would contain. But he nodded. "Play them." The room filled with broken voices. Fear forced through discipline. We followed doctrine, nothing worked. They let us move, then cut off every option. It's not combat, it's... The transmission ended abruptly. Another began. This one quieter, more controlled, which somehow made it worse. They're not trying to destroy us quickly. A pause. They're making sure we understand. Silence. Then the feed died. No one spoke, because that was the part no one could accept. Understanding. The Empire didn't need to understand its enemies. It needed to defeat them. But humanity wanted them to see it. "Admiral," one of the officers said, his voice lower than before. "Morale is declining across multiple clusters." Morale. Another word that shouldn't matter. Not to them. But now it did. Because fear didn't start as panic. It started as doubt. "Stabilize communications," Valen ordered. "Reinforce command structure." But even as he gave the order, he could see it. On the display, in the movement of ships, in the hesitation between actions. The Empire wasn't breaking. Not yet. But it was slowing. And in this battlefield, slowing meant losing. "Admiral, human vessels are shifting again." Valen turned. The central formation, The one surrounding the compression zone was changing. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. "They're opening gaps," the tactical officer said. "Why?" someone asked. It looked like an opportunity, a chance, escape routes, clear paths through the tightening field. "They're making a mistake," another officer said quickly. "We can push through those gaps, regain distance, reform." "No." Valen's voice cut through the room. Sharp, immediate, final. Every eye turned to him. "That's not a mistake," he said quietly. "It's an invitation." Silence followed, because they understood. Too quickly, too clearly. "They want us to move," the intelligence officer whispered. "Yes," Valen replied. "They want us to choose." Because that was the pattern. That was the doctrine. Humans didn't force decisions. They shaped them, guided them, until the only choices left were the ones they wanted. "Admiral, we can't just stay here," another officer argued. "The compression field is still tightening. If we don't move, we lose," Valen finished. "And if we do move," he didn't finish that sentence. He didn't have to, because the answer was the same: lose. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating quiet, because, for the first time in Imperial history, there was no correct move. "Admiral," the communications officer said slowly, "we're receiving a direct transmission." Valen's gaze didn't shift. Source. The center. Of course it was. Put it through. The main display flickered, then stabilized. The same human appeared, calm, focused, unmoved by the chaos surrounding them. Behind them, faintly visible, the core of the battlefield pulsed with controlled distortion. Alive, breathing. "Your fleets are adapting," the human said. It wasn't praise. It wasn't mockery. It was observation. Valen stepped forward. "You're prolonging this." A slight tilt of the head. "Yes." No denial. No hesitation. "Why?" Valen demanded. "If you have the capability to end this, why haven't you?" The human studied him for a moment, then answered, "Because you still think this is a battle." The words settled into the room like gravity. "This is not about defeating you," the human continued. "It's about ensuring you understand why you lost." A ripple of unease passed through the command crew. Valen's expression hardened. "We will not break." The human's gaze didn't change. "I know." That answer was worse than anything else. No anger, no threat, just certainty. "Then what is the point of this?" Valen pressed. The human looked past him, as if seeing the entire battlefield at once. "Your empire expands by assumption," they said. "You see a world, you decide it's weak, and then you act." A pause. "This time you were wrong." The distortion behind them pulsed again, stronger, more focused. "And now you'll remember." The transmission ended. The screen went dark. No final words, no threats, just that. "Memory." "Admiral," one of the officers whispered. Valen didn't respond, because he understood now. This wasn't just about winning. This wasn't even about survival. This was about consequence. The Empire had chosen Earth, had marked it, had declared it expendable, and humanity had decided to answer, not with destruction, but with something far more dangerous. A lesson. "Admiral, the gaps are still open," the tactical officer said, voice tense. "We need to decide." Yes, they did. Stay and be compressed. Move and be guided. Either way, the outcome had already been shaped. Valen stared at the display, at the ships, at the narrowing space, at the invisible lines humanity had drawn. And for the first time in his entire career, he realized something he had never had to face before. This war was already decided. They were just living through it. By the time the first fleet vanished, the Empire still tried to explain it. A tactical failure, a localized anomaly, an isolated loss, because anything else would mean accepting something far worse. "Admiral, we've lost contact with Outer Cluster 7. The report came in flat, controlled, professional, but the silence that followed it wasn't. Valen didn't look away from the display. Define lost. No signal, no debris, no distortion remnants. They were there, and now they're not. Gone. Not destroyed. Not scattered. Erased. Replay last known telemetry. The data streamed across the screen. Cluster 7, 23 ships, holding formation near the outer edge of the compression field. Engines active. System stable. Then, a ripple. Small. Almost insignificant. Space bent inward for less than a second. And when it released, the ships were gone. No explosion. No radiation spike. No wreckage. Just absence. Again, Valen said. The playback repeated. Same result. Same impossibility. That's not a weapon, one of the officers whispered. No, the intelligence officer replied. It's a transfer. Valen's eyes narrowed. To where? No one answered. Because the answer didn't exist. Or, worse, it did. And they simply couldn't reach it. Admiral, another cluster has disappeared. This time closer. Closer to the center. Closer to whatever humanity had built. The display flickered as more markers vanished. One by one. Then in groups. Then entire formations at once. They're accelerating it, someone said. Yes, Valen replied quietly. They are. Because the setup was complete. The battlefield shaped. The empire contained. Now, the final phase had begun. Admiral, reinforcement fleets are attempting to retreat. The command snapped through the chamber. Valen didn't react immediately. Vectors. Outward, maximum thrust. They're trying to break past the distortion boundary. Can they? A pause. Then, no. Because every path outward no longer led outward. Ships pushed forward, engines screaming, pouring power into escape vectors that looked correct, but weren't. Distances stretched. Angles shifted. And the more they tried to leave, the deeper they drifted inward. They're running in circles, the tactical officer said. Not circles, Valen corrected. Spirals. Slow, subtle, inevitable. Every movement feeding into the same destination. The center. Admiral, we're receiving emergency transmissions from the retreating fleets. Play them. The audio filled the room. Not panic. Not yet. But something close. Navigation is lying to us. We're moving away, but the distance is decreasing. This doesn't make sense. Another voice cut in. Sharper. Breaking. We can see it now. Static. Then silence. What can they see? One officer asked. No one answered. Because deep down, they already knew. Admiral, the intelligence officer, said slowly. Valen didn't look at him. What? The center. Valen's gaze shifted. Focused. Zoomed. And for the first time, he saw it. Not as data. Not as distortion. But as structure. A region where space itself folded inward layer upon layer. Not collapsing. Not exploding. But compressing. Controlled. Precise. A convergence point. That's where they're sending us, someone whispered. Yes, Valen said, but not all of us. Because some ships never reached it. They vanished before they got close. Removed early. Filtered. Selected. Admiral, what decides who disappears and who doesn't? An officer asked. Valen didn't answer immediately. Because the answer was forming. They're studying us, he said at last. The room went still. Every movement, every decision, every attempt to adapt. He gestured to the display. The ones who behave predictably vanish first. A cold realization spread. The ones who adapt, another officer said slowly. They last longer, Valen finished. Not spared, not saved, just delayed. Because this wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It was evaluation, a process, a system. Admiral, we're next. The words came quietly, but they didn't need volume. The compression field had tightened around Valen's cluster. The distortions were stronger here, sharper, more focused. The human ships, closer, watching, waiting. Admiral, the communications officer said, voice steady despite everything. Final transmission request from multiple ships. Valen closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, then nodded. Open channel. The silence that followed was different, heavier, final. This is Admiral Valen of the Imperial Armada. His voice carried across the fleet, across the battlefield, across whatever humanity had turned this place into. We have encountered an enemy unlike any we have faced. No response. No interruption. They do not fight as we do. They do not think as we do. A pause. They do not seek victory. His gaze fixed on the center, on the impossible structure waiting there. They seek certainty. Another pause. Longer this time. If this transmission reaches the Empire, understand this. The room stood still, listening, remembering. Earth is not a target. His voice hardened. It is a threshold. The words settled into the void. A warning. Too late. Do not return. The transmission ended. No final orders. No rallying cry. Just truth. Admiral, one of the officers whispered. Valen didn't respond. Because there was nothing left to say. The distortions surged. Stronger than before. The space around them tightening, folding, drawing inward. Impact in 5, 4. The countdown echoed. Not from a weapon, but from inevitability. 3. The human ships held position, perfectly still, watching. 2. The stars themselves seemed to bend, stretch, collapse. 1. And then, everything went silent. Not darkness, not destruction, just nothing. The markers vanished. The signal ceased. The fleet was gone. And in the vast emptiness where they had once been, only one thing remained. A single fragment of a transmission, broken, distorted, looping endlessly into the void. They were waiting. The Empire did not record defeats. It archived anomalies. That was how it survived for so long, by refusing to accept that anything could truly challenge it. Every failure was reclassified, every loss reframed, every unknown filed away until it became understood, and then erased. But this time, there was too much missing. Entire fleets, gone. No debris fields, no survivors, no battle recordings, just silence and fragments. They were waiting. The broken transmission looped endlessly inside the Imperial Archive chamber, distorted beyond clarity, yet impossible to ignore. It had been recovered from the edge of known space, far beyond where any engagement should have taken place. No coordinates, no explanation, only that. They were waiting. The High Strategist stood before the projection, unmoving. Around him, the council chamber remained quieter than it had ever been. No laughter, no dismissive murmurs, no arrogance, because the report in front of them could not be rewritten. Confirm loss, he said. A subordinate stepped forward, voice carefully controlled. Primary assault fleet lost. A pause. Reinforcement fleets lost. Another pause. Total vessels unaccounted for, 912. The number lingered in the air. Too large, too complete, too final. Cause, the strategist asked. The subordinate hesitated, then said the only truth left. Unknown. The word struck harder than any admission of defeat. Unknown meant uncontrollable. Uncontrollable meant dangerous. And dangerous meant the Empire had made a mistake. The projection shifted. Earth appeared once more, rotating slowly in the center of the chamber. Unchanged, untouched, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. That world, one of the council members said quietly, should not still exist. But it did, because humanity had never been trying to survive. They had been waiting. Analyze remaining data, the strategist ordered. The system responded instantly, compiling every fragment, every signal, every distortion pattern recovered from the edges of the event. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Patterns began to form, incomplete, broken, but consistent. They shaped the battlefield, one analyst said, not just locally system-wide. Another stepped forward. They embedded coordination into environmental manipulation. No central command, no communication chains. A third voice joined. They removed predictability, then punished it. The strategist listened, silent, absorbing. And then, they did not defeat our fleets, he said. The room stilled. They made defeat inevitable. No one argued, because no one could. The data didn't show a battle. It showed a process, a sequence, a design, and the Empire had followed it perfectly. Why? One council member asked. The strategist turned his gaze back to Earth. Because that was the only question that mattered now. Because we chose them, he said. A quiet understanding spread through the chamber. The Empire had marked Earth, had declared it weak, had decided its fate before ever understanding it. And humanity had responded, not with resistance, not with desperation, but with preparation. They knew we would come, another council member whispered. Yes, the strategist replied. And they knew how we would fight, because the Empire had never needed to change. Its doctrine had always worked, until it didn't. Then we adapt, one of the generals said, regaining some measure of confidence. We study this. We develop counters. We return with. No. The word cut through the chamber like a blade. Sharp, immediate, final. I turned to the strategist. We do not return. Silence followed. Heavy, absolute. Sir, the general asked carefully. The strategist didn't look at him. Did you not listen to the transmission? A gesture. The fragment played again. They were waiting. He let it repeat once, then ended it. That was not a warning, he said. It was a fact. A slow breath, measured, controlled. They were waiting not for that fleet. The realization hit like a shockwave. They were waiting for us. Not a task force, not an invasion. The Empire itself, its patterns, its assumptions, its certainty, everything that made it powerful, also made it predictable. And humanity had used that. Earth is not a conquest, the strategist continued. It is a boundary, a line, invisible, unspoken, but now undeniable. We expand until we encounter resistance we cannot overcome, he said. That has always been our nature. His gaze hardened. This is that resistance. The chamber remained still, because the truth was too clear to deny. This wasn't a loss they could correct. It wasn't a strategy they could counter quickly. It was something deeper, something fundamental. A species that didn't fight to win battles, but to define outcomes before battles even began. What do we do? Someone asked. For the first time, the Empire didn't have an answer ready. The strategist looked at Earth one last time, at the blue world that had been labeled easy conquest, at the species that had erased an entire armada without ever appearing desperate, at the silence that had started it all. And he made a decision. We remember. Not revenge, not retaliation, not immediate adaptation. Memory. Because that was what humanity had given them. A lesson carved into absence. A warning written in vanished fleets. A truth that could not be ignored. The projection dimmed. Earth faded from the center of the chamber. But the weight of it remained. Because somewhere out there, beyond the edge of understanding, humanity still waited. Not for war, not for conquest, but for the next mistake. And now, the Empire knew better than to make one. If you've made it this far on HFY Global Tales, you've just witnessed one of humanity's most terrifying truths. Sometimes, the strongest move isn't fighting harder. It's making sure the fight was already decided. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who loves sci-fi.